Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Cardboard Herald, my chance to talk with creative gamers and game creators. And joining me today is returning guest, Spirit Island designer R. Eric Royce. Welcome back to the show, Eric.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here again.
Yeah, man. Well, last time I talked to you was October 2018. And aside from all the quarantine business that's going on right now, what's been going on with Jagged Earth since then? Because last time we talked, you were like, well, you know, we had the Kickstarter, but now the actual development process has begun. So, you know, where are you at right now? Is Jagged Earth wrapped up from a design and development perspective?
Yep, absolutely. The files were all sent off to the publisher sometime, I'm not sure exactly how many months ago, but back vague, sometime between last October, last February. I think it was maybe last January. Again, I don't know exactly. Once I hand off the files to Greater Than Games, generally it sort of, stops being my department. And so exactly when the button got pushed to send them over, I'm not sure. But development, most largely wrapped up last year, sort of in the middle of 2019. Although there was some sort of final trailing bits going on through the summer and the like. During that time, they were doing all the layout and making sure all the art got in, getting all that stuff. So getting everything finalized. And then, of course, there was proofing, which always takes, a certain amount of attention for any game. And Spirit Island is a game with a lot of things.
Yeah, for sure.
Lots of stuff in it. And so like the first time around when the original base game proofing came around, that took an unexpectedly long time. This time, it took an expectedly long time.
Good. Well, let's talk about that department, your department. So, yeah. We end that call in October 2018, and you have through the mid 2019 in order to do that development. What are the sorts of things from the time that the Kickstarter initially rolled until you handed over all the files that actually needed to happen? Did you have all the groundwork of the spirits before Jagged Earth was announced?
All the spirits were known at that point. There was, before the Kickstarter, back sort of, that spring 2018, I went out to Geekway for the West and met with Greater Than Games. And when I was there, we sat down and we figured out sort of like, okay, of the candidate spirits that we have, which we've been testing, which ones would make a good roster for Jagged Earth? And mostly it was based on which ones were most complete and sort of tested best. But there were a few which ended up omitted because they might fit better in some other future expansion, just in certain terms of theme or the like. And so we had that all set out. And there was one late substitution just like a month or two before the Kickstarter, which resulted in, but we also specified like one or two alternates because spirits are in testing, but you never really know, you can get a sense of, okay, it's getting better, but you don't really know that it's going to totally work until you're done with it. And so there's, if you have a group of 12 spirits and you say, okay, great, these all have a 90 to 95% chance of being fine. That means statistically, one of them probably won't be. So we had a couple of alternates and one of those stepped in. And so that was Downpour. So Downpour was a little bit less finished as of the time of the Kickstarter and turned out to be one of the spirits that needed more balancing attention. But we knew as of the Kickstarter start, like all of them had core mechanics done, had a fair amount of testing done. They were all done with design is what I'd say. Like the core concept was complete and it was a matter of tweaking and balancing.
Well, I got to know about some of these ones that were left on the cutting room floor for possible future expansions. And I'm sure you got to be a little bit cagey about what you can share. But can you even like tease what some of the cool stuff that may be on the horizon for future Spirit Island content is?
Let's see. If I'm sufficiently vague about it, I think I can be.
Excellent. I'll take it.
Especially because even for the spirits which are done with design on the Kickstarter, they say this is subject to change and could look totally different by the time you see it. The concepts I'm about to mention, even more so. Like sometimes I'll start exploring a concept and it just ends up dead ending. So but there, for example, there was one spirit which started the game not just with its 4 unique power cards, but with an additional few power cards, or not power cards, an additional few cards which were not power cards. which it used in a way different from power cards. And I think there were, in some incarnations there were 3 of them, and others there were 5 of them. Exactly how they worked changed enough times that I'm not even going to say how they worked, because it'll be different by the time the spirit ever comes out. But that was one notion. There's another one. I've made no secret of the fact that at some point in the future I'd like to do a Dahan-centric expansion. There was at least one spirit which was, this really belongs thematically in a more Dahan-centric expansion. It's a concept that sort of thematically played with the Dahan, although in a very different way than Thunderspeaker did.
Well, that's really interesting to think about, because here you're describing one real mechanically focused thing, which is the additional cards that you're playing, and then you're also describing someone who's fitting in thematically in how they interact with the denizens of the island itself. Is it interchangeable for you where you draw your inspiration from? Do you generally start with some sort of mechanical function and see how that would thematically be interpreted in the world of the game? Or do you start with a thematic idea, and how would a spirit who interacts with the theme of the game actually be affecting the mechanics?
It goes either way. Some spirits come from one, some come from the other, but whichever one I start on, I end up ping-ponging to the other very rapidly.
I see.
If I have a mechanical idea, the first thing I do will invariably be to say, okay, this is a neat mechanic. What might it represent thematically? And brainstorm thematic ideas. And then that tends to inform, then it bounces back, and that may change what the mechanical idea becomes. It's like, oh, that was a neat idea, but it's going to be, it's thematically representing this aspect of nature, and that aspect of nature will work a little differently, so maybe it should go more like this. On the other side, if I come up with a thematic idea, then after I do my initial thematic brainstorm, I'll be like, okay, how could this be represented mechanically? Come up with a bunch of ideas and then figure out, okay, which of these are most mechanically interesting, which haven't been done before. And then again, that might tie back to, okay, that doesn't quite fit in, which fits better. It's a process. It's like, docking 2 spaceships or something. I don't know. The two need to meet up, but there's wiggle room on both ends.
Of course.
In the case of the one with extra cards, that spirit actually came from a thematic concept, which then led to these extra cards that the spirit starts off with. So that even though I've presented it thematically, that one actually started thematic. Even though I presented it mechanically, that one started thematically.
Of the new spirits that you have in Jagged Earth, which one do you feel like had the most iteration on it? The one that was maybe the hardest to nail exactly how it was going to operate within the game?
I'm not sure I can give a single one, but I can give a cluster of them.
I'll take them.
Unsurprisingly, it correlates very highly with complexity of the spirits. The 3 highest complexity spirits, Finder of Paths Unseen, Starlight Seeks Its Form, and Fractured Days Split the Sky. Those 3 all took a lot of iteration, because they're doing a lot of things and doing some very weird things. So they took a lot of attention. And in each case, it was a different sort of attention. Each of the 3 has their own story that I could cheerfully tell. Of the high complexity spirits, the ones which took most attention were probably Vengeance is a Burning Plague and Downpour Drenches the World. Vengeance, mostly for balance. Vengeance's core concept came together pretty quickly, but it was massively overpowered. And so it needed to be scaled back repeatedly but while doing that, it's much easier to take a spirit and make it more powerful while keeping its theme intact than it is to make it less powerful while keeping its theme intact. Because when you're stripping out power, you might end up removing some of the dynamics which make that spirit, which connect with that spirit's theme. But it's nearly always pretty easy to add power in thematically appropriate ways. And sometimes being able to add power allows you to represent facets of a theme which you couldn't otherwise get in.
Are there spirits that you preserved within the game that had dramatic changes from how their whole mechanical concept even worked?
Downpour Drenches the World went through, I think, 3 major iterations, and that means like a major iteration with many smaller internal iterations.
Of course.
Even before the Kickstarter happened. Its core conceit of repeating powers multiple times as a representation of its nature, of what it is too much of a good thing, basically, or lots of a good thing, possibly too much of it. One thing, just a torrent. So previously, it had done all kinds of things like messing around with turning lands into wetlands and flooding and isolation, and it took many iterations to find that core conceit. Then once that happened, it turns out that that mechanical representation has a lot of very non-obvious effects. There's these follow-on effects. Like, it's okay, if you can repeat powers lots of times, you end up wanting relatively few card plays, so that players will tend to focus more on, here, I have this one card. Like, Downpour's mechanical shtick is like, I only can play this one power card this turn, but I can use it 4 times. Or maybe I can play these 2, but I can use them between the 2 of them, I can use them 5 times. And that's great and neat and interesting, but it means that with only 1 or 2 power cards in play, that the amount of variance in number of elements they have in play is much smaller between its lowest plays and its highest plays than other spirits, which means its innate power gating gets weird, because the number of power cards a spirit can have in play is sort of a cap on how many of a given element it can have, barring special things like elemental boon being given to it. So it ran into these weird scaling issues where either it just didn't get more powerful enough, or it could get more powerful too quickly if it rushed plays really quickly. And so that was a strange and thorny knot, which ended up then getting sort of untied/cut by turning its energy track into an elements track, which was something I'd been wanting to do with the spirit anyway. Like, I've had spirits which did that before, but it always ended up getting cut. And so this was a prime example. It's like, okay, great, excellent. I think it ends up having 1 or 2 spaces where you get more energy on it, but mostly it's just like, here, have more elements on the top track.
It seems like because this is a big expansion for now a beloved game that people are well acquainted for, this is a lot of room for getting creative with the spirits. Like, this can be Eric Unleashed, just coming up with concept after concept. People already have familiarity with Spirit Island, so this way you can kind of test the bounds of what the game can deliver. But are any of the spirits in the expansion new player friendly? I mean, you have the original 4, right? That you have aspects coming out for, and you are going to evolve them. But are there going to be spirits that you think people would be comfortable learning the game with in Jagged Earth?
I wouldn't recommend any of the spirits in Jagged Earth for a first-time player, but there's a number of them which are moderate complexity, which I feel like a player who has a few, anybody who's comfortable playing Thunder Speaker or Spread of Rampant Green should be fine with. Somebody who has, I can't say how many games that is, because for some people that's on game 2, and for other people that's on game 18. It really varies per person. So no, originally I assumed that I would need to put in a pair of low complexity spirits because, okay, all right, let's try and keep a few more. Low complexity spirits are by far and away the hardest to make. They are not necessarily the most time consuming to test, because once they're made, they're simple, but getting them, what's that quote? There's some famous quote about please, I apologize for the length of this letter. I did not have time to write a shorter one. Being concise and effectively communicating takes effort. Similarly, having a spirit which does everything it needs to do, but is in a very tight package, also is, you have very few brushstrokes, metaphorically speaking. You're trying to paint a picture and you're being told, okay, you get exactly 5 brushstrokes, paint a picture of a cathedral. It's like, okay, all right, like that takes a lot more talent than painting a picture of a cathedral using 100 brushstrokes. You need to really get it through, even though the end result is going to seem much simpler. So I'd assumed I was going to need to do a low complexity spirit or 2, and I had, 4 concepts in the queue, but one after another, one didn't work out because its presence placement pattern was all wonky, and so it ended up being either too subject to presence rush, and I'm like, okay, so I have it up on blocks, tinkering with it. And another one was interesting. It was an extremely co-op focused spirit, but it ran into some problems that intrinsically, heavy support spirits in Spirit Island run into certain difficulties, and it was running into them, and I needed to retool and retrench. And also, it turns out that it would work better with some future stuff which hasn't been released yet. So, okay, all right, so that's probably not coming out. And then there was this other one which was working as low complexity, but really had this one subsystem which was awesome, but would push it up into medium complexity. And that became Shifting Memory of Ages, which was included because Greater Than Games came to me and said, no, actually, our own data and the data from all the distributors says that people who buy expansions are overwhelmingly people who have played a fair amount of the base game, and what they're looking for is more, and they're not looking for the low complexity stuff. Like, so no, you have no more than 2, but it would be totally fine to have 0. And I'm like, great, fantastic. Because, like if I had one and it had fit, I would have included it. I wasn't like on a crusade against them.
Right.
They're nice to have, and I enjoy, like if I'm playing casually, recreationally with my friends, I play low complexity spirits as much as any of the others. Like they're not just for beginners.
Totally.
But where I was at the time with the spirits I had at the time, it was much easier to just go, okay, great, moderate and up. Moderate complexity and up, especially because going higher complexity lets me get more detailed in my thematic implementations. Shifting Memory of Ages could have survived without the elemental token banking system that it has, but it's awesome. It's fantastic. And it's a great representation of something which the Spirit does.
There's a children's book that I've loved since I was a kid. It was called Math Curse. It's by John Sheshka. And the opening of the story has this kid in their like 3rd grade class, and their teacher, Mrs. Fibonacci, says, you can think of almost anything as a math problem. And the kid is cursed with this math curse throughout the rest of the book, is everything is a math problem. And I almost wonder if you are spirit cursed now, in that every aspect of your life you start examining through the lens of, could this be a spirit in Spirit Island? I mean, it's such an imaginative game, and you can really get buck wild in the thematic concepts that you can interpret into the game. Like, do you find yourself just interpreting all sorts of things around you as possibilities for spirits and spirit powers?
In my day-to-day life, less so. If I'm out in nature, more so. Whenever I'm, if I'm out hiking, or if a really impressive thunderstorm sweeps in, or something like that, then that was part of. There have been a couple of spirits where there have been specific moments where I'm out in nature where I can look back and say, oh, yeah. Like, Many Minds Move as one came from a number of different places, but the catalyzing instant was when I was out for a walk and this flock of like 60 Canada geese all kind of looked up at me in this one moment in synchrony with this, you want to start something kind of look on. Not the geese have facial expressions as we know it, but their body language was like, yeah. The Canada geese around here, like, they don't take any they're the ones who are making the crap. They're not taking the crap.
Hey, I'm Alaskan. I know what's up with Canadian geese. They are fierce creatures. I don't want to mess with them.
Yep.
Well, I know that spirits are certainly the flashiest aspect of Spirit Island. They're the one that people want to engage with, but the meat of Spirit Island is all the rest of the things that flush that out, the things that you interact with. And so throughout Jagged Earth, like, what were some of the other aspects of it that were the most complicated to address during this development process? Was it having the separate island system, or was it some of the new like invader kingdoms? Was it the aspect cards? Like, what was a real significant design hurdle for you?
The biggest is adversaries, no questions asked, because they are like layer cakes, or actually a better comparison would be geology, where each level builds on the last. So if you have any instability beneath, it creates instability above. You really need to work them out a few layers at a time, because if you're working on adversary levels 5 and 6, and then you need to go back and change level 2, unless you're just doing something like, okay, swap 2 and 3 so that the top upper levels are unaffected, then if it's like, oh, let's make a core mechanical change to how level 2 of this adversary works, it will affect everything above it. So you really want to hash out the lower levels first and get them solid and stable, which means that you have this sort of incremental progressive all right, make sure that each thing works before moving on too much to the next one. Thankfully, with the new combining adversary system, it's more possible to do that, because otherwise you have playtesters who are used to going up against difficulty 8 to 10, trying to test difficulty 1 and 2 adversaries, and they're like, I don't know, it seems easy. I have no idea. I stomped them on turn 4. So but then if you cross them with the Brandenburg Prussia level 4, then it all works out okay.
Well, you have so much to test and account for in this game. I mean, just thinking about the minor and major powers alone, I mean, that in combination with the different adversaries that you have, in combination with the different spirits that may be at the table, how do you even playtest this game? What does that look like?
For Jagged Earth, it was in many ways way easier than it was for the base game. For the base game, it was all very sort of, there was no fixed point in space. It was all, okay, all right, let's hope that, okay, these adversaries, we want a coherent difficulty scale, but I don't know, we'll take this one as a reference point and kind of pat everything towards it. Same thing with the spirits. There was no established difficulty or power level for the spirits. It was so this time around, at least there was an existing sort of corpus which playtester could go against, and also just more people who were playing the game at a high level. So in that case, it was good. Starting off, I would generally ask playtesters to not play against new adversaries with new spirits as much, at least when we're going for anything resembling balance. If you're going for concept, that's fine. But if you're going for any sort of balance testing, or adversaries were one of the first things I started working on. They're also one of the last things I finished off. I finished the very last bits of testing last year were not for how does this adversary work? That was nailed down. It was for how difficult is this adversary? What is the difficulty level which should be printed on it? Is this a 10 or an 11 or a 12? And so that was, because of course, you have to go through everything else and figure out all the lower levels. Then you have to figure out the upper levels. And now you have to figure out how difficult the upper levels are, which you can't do until they're mechanically pinned down. The major and minor powers I tend to just mix in, although I say mix in, I'll throw them into a game, but I'll often have separate decks for new powers to test and old powers which already exist. And then for any power draw of 4, I'll say take 2 from the new deck, 2 from the old. Because if you do all new, that's not a good measurement for, okay, would I take this over something which already exists? Or is this just always dominating over existing choices? But if you just shuffle them in, then if you're dealing with, they may only be a third or a quarter of the new deck, and they don't come up as often as you like. So you kind of want them to come up frequently. So I'll sort of try and artificially make sure that they come up often, sometimes even stacking the deck if there's a particular trouble. If there's okay, right, this power, I'm not really sure about it, like a major, which I don't know how it's going. I'll make sure it's in the top, 10 major powers in the deck in a 3 or 4 player game, so that it'll come up in one of the first few draws.
The major powers are some of the most cinematic moments in the game, right? I mean, especially when you get into Branch and Claw and suddenly there's major powers that are removing entire pieces of the island. And those are some of the moments that are most memorable for me, and the thing that I'm most looking forward to in having happen in Jagged Earth. Do you have some of those really potent moments waiting in the wings that you're excited for people to get to the table?
Yeah, there's one, I can spoil one of them. I already spoiled it on Reddit, but not everybody saw that particular one. So I'll give the count, all right, if you don't want spoilers, then fast forward, I don't know, 60 seconds or something. So there's one called Draw Down into a Consuming Void, which gathers a whole bunch of stuff, including cities, then obliterates, it does, I don't know, 50, some 10 damage, 20 damage, something along with it. And then it has a threshold, which is not elemental, which is the first thing.
Oh.
Instead, it is if you have no other power cards in play.
Okay.
Then you can forget a major and a minor and a unique to repeat this power on the same land.
Okay. That's amazing. It's pulsating and bringing everything in.
It's basically a black hole. It's just drawing in everything and wrecking it. Well, I shouldn't say everything, because this power does not cause blight. It's only drawing in the things which shouldn't belong there. The trees, the landscape, it's all fine. It's just the invaders and the Dahan. Don't do this near the Dahan. Or it's also not friendly to beasts or spirit presence.
Okay.
So you want to be careful about it, but it doesn't cause blight. But it's a big one, and it costs lots of energy, gives you no elements. It is in many ways it's not anti-elemental, but it is a void. It does not have any of the elemental energies of the world. So that is one of them. There's another one which I'm not going to spoil because I'm looking forward to people unwrapping it and going, "Oh, you can do that." That's so I'm not telling it. And actually, there may be 2 or 3 like that, or maybe 4. One of the design principles of major powers is like, they need to have a certain number of just raw like beat sticks, which do a lot of damage and stuff. But
right.
There should also be like ideally enough that in most major power choices of 4, you look at them, you're like, well, that would make this game go in a new direction, wouldn't it? Like that's sort of the ideal, is that it can just change up how you approach the game, especially if you get it early.
With the minor and major powers that you're designing, do you ever think about them from the perspective of like, this is ideally paired with this spirit, but is overall fairly useful for a good handful of spirits? Because I know at least in Branch and Claw in the base game, there are certainly some powers where you're like, this is thematically and mechanically tied to this spirit. Like it is exceptionally potent in their hands.
Absolutely. It is a litmus test I'll often use is I'll take it can be for either minors or majors. With major powers, I tend to think of it in sort of the, I don't know, anime style ultimate attack kind of thing. Like, see which spirits can easily hit the threshold and think, okay, is this an appropriate, given what this power does that work with these spirits? For a minor, it's more, okay, do the elements given on this minor power, like what spirits are incentivized to take this given their innate powers? And, does that make sense? The elemental system is there. It's there to create a thematic linkage between powers and spirits while still giving spirits the freedom to change and not be who they were at the start of the game. So, that's very much part of their purpose. And like, there's mostly it works out really well. There's a few whiffs, like Call to Trade and Branch and Claw has elements which work for the reason, like the associations are valid on paper, but if you look at which spirits are incentivized to take the card, it doesn't end up quite working out thematically. It's a little weird one. If there's ever like a second edition or something, then that's one of the ones where I'll go and tweak the elements and fix that so that it's, because there are some spirits where Call to Trade is much more apropos. But it just doesn't end up quite syncing up. The others, however, for the most part, and I'm very happy with where the minor power decks have ended up for both published stuff and Jagged Earth. And which spirits are good with this is absolutely, it's not always like the first consideration, but it's definitely something I'll take into account.
Spirit Island is, I've talked about it many times, is one of my favorite, if not my current favorite game. It's a game that I love playing solo. I love playing multiplayer. I love experimenting with all the different spirits and everything. But one of the criticisms about the game, even among people who enjoy the game quite a bit, is that there's sometimes an element of anticlimax, right? Like you start playing the game and then you are up against this really insurmountable obstacle and then you pass a threshold and I've won this game, but there's still 30 to 45 minutes of cleanup of acting after that because you've reached a certain level of power between you and the other players. You've done whatever it needs to have happen, but then you're just carrying out actions until the final victory condition is met. Is that something you see as inherent to the game, or is that something that you've tried to address either through adversaries or other elements?
It is something that I think is moderately baked into the game as it is. There are mitigating factors. One is that people will, because the mid game looks so overwhelming in terms of the things. On average, many people play on a difficulty level lower than they could actually win on.
For sure.
And if you do that, then you will get more of the effect which you just described. In general, the closer, the more difficult the game you give yourself relative to your own skill level, the less that will happen, and the closer victory will tend to come to. It'll be like, okay, all right, Are we holding on this turn? Okay, yes. Can we squeak out a win this turn? Yes, we can. Good, because I don't know what would have happened next turn. Events can also help mitigate it, but even in those cases, like with events, and if you're playing on a good difficulty level, it can still absolutely crop up. And it is something that ideally I'd like to design around, but I've done some experimenting with things which might be able to help mitigate it a bit more, but they would probably require either some structural changes, which I don't think would work well as a retrofit. So that's the sort of thing which would have to wait for like a second edition. Or I have ideas which I have had in my head, but I just honestly haven't had time to test. And they might also sort of in the same category as boosting the difficulty and using events to add some uncertainty. I suspect they wouldn't be a panacea, which would make it vanish under the winds, but which would, be like, okay, now it is less of a thing that happens.
Totally.
So, but yeah, no, it's something on my mind. It's something I'd like to get rid of. I see it as a flaw in the game, not a critical flaw. Like, no, the game would be better if it didn't do that. So it would be nice to address, but it's not worth gutting the rest of the game just to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, obviously the game isn't broken. You don't want to entirely fix it. People dig it. It's one of the most popular board games in existence right now. And speaking of it in existence, it's now in virtual space because it just came out as a digital version. Were you involved at all in the digital development, or is that just something you were like, hey, I've been informed this is going to be in a digital game now, but that's someone else's department?
I was involved to the extent that my time allowed. Between a variety of other obligations, I could not get super heavy into it. But the team at Handelabra was great about sort of, talking to me and consulting with me on things. They've been super good about, making sure that the game is faithful to the rules. And were very clear with me, like, if I had opinions on things, please, like, come forward. They said they were very, very, they were great about that, which was fantastic. I am particularly looking, it's in early access right now, and a lot of the sound design is not yet finished, because it's early access. Or at least it wasn't last I played. I have been focusing on other things now, which we'll get to in a little bit. So I haven't actually played it in a few weeks. So I'm not sure exactly where it stands at this instant, especially by the time this podcast comes out. But as of my last play, the sound wasn't finished, but like I did a whole bunch of talking with their sound designer about like what types of sounds would be appropriate for the different spirits and layering them together and that kind of stuff, which was loads of fun. Yeah, some involvement, and they occasionally will ping me with obscure edge cases to rules, which in at least one case has resulted in, all right, we need to formalize this thing for the game as a whole, because like it's only kind of vaguely sort of very occasionally relevant for the tabletop version, but in a digital version which needs to adhere to the rules strictly because the computer needs to know what the rules are, it's actually super important.
Give me an example. What is that?
Sure. Thunder Speaker has 2 innate powers, each of which has a 4 air threshold, which says this power may be fast. The question is, if you have 4 air, but nothing else, so that the power would do nothing else, does that count as using the power?
I see. Yeah.
Because playtesters were like, I'm being told I have this innate power available for use, but it doesn't do anything. All I hit was that 1 threshold, which seems kind of weird. And so there they go to me, they're like, how should it work? It's like, well, that's an interesting question because most of the time it's not mechanically relevant, but every now and then it is. Oh, here's another neat thing I can preview from Jagged Earth. In Jagged Earth, there's a minor power which is called Scream Disease into the Wind, which is actually a quote from the flavor text from Branch and Claw, which enough people have told me they like, that I'm like, okay, let's make this into a power card. And to give credit where credit is due, the inspiration for that particular turn of phrase came from a song called "It Screams Disease" by a group named Carfax Abbey. But anyhow, so this power card, Scream Disease into the Wind, is a boon you play on another spirit. It gives them both a +1 range, and once during the turn, after they use a power on a land, they may also add a disease to that land. So the question becomes, if someone played that on Thunder Speaker, would Thunder Speaker be able to use one of their an empty innate power to place a disease? So it is mechanically relevant, although not yet. And so after a bunch of, and it can crop up for other things as well. Shroud of Silent Mist has a presence movement which keys off of using a power. And the Jagged Earth rulebook goes so far as to say, like, innate powers where you hit no thresholds are not considered used. So Shroud of Silent Mist can't just like use its innates with no effects every turn. So, and it finally came down to, okay, all right, after a bunch of thinking and looking at things and figuring out, okay, what precedent do we want to set here? The idea is, no, there's some game effects, range buffs, changing fast versus slow, and a couple of other things, which are kind of sort of internal modifiers, meta effects. And if all you have are those, the power doesn't do anything, and you're not considered to be doing anything on the board. The power is not used if all you're doing is adding range to it, but it still can't accomplish anything. So that is an example of a rules clarification which sort of came out of that, which came out of the digital process.
Well, that's the geeky kind of minutia that I love exploring. And I know that there's a lot of game designers and game developers and even publishers who love listening to these interview podcasts, who love that kind of minutia about playtesting, about like interesting, minute questions that come up through development. But I can't spend all my time talking about Spirit Island because you also have another game that just kickstarted and inevitably is going to hit retail release here, and that's For Science with Gray Fox Games. So tell me about this game. This seems like a dramatic shift from what you're best known for, Spirit Island. All of a sudden you have a 15-minute real-time dexterity spatial puzzle game. What's up with this?
So For Science, it is actually in some way, it predates Spirit Island, the original design. Yes, not by a lot. So back in 2012, when I had my first kid, I had two designs which were sort of in the late stages, which I was like, okay, these are the closest designs I have to being pitch worthy. One was Spirit Island, and the other was For Science. And the two signed. For Science took a little longer to sign, but I signed it with Gray Fox in 2015. It has just been going through development for 5 years.
Wow. That's incredible.
It is, yeah. So it's anyway, as you say, it's a real-time dexterity spatial co-op. You and your fellow players are sort of a variety of scientists and or managers and or lab assistants, and or the coffee guy in a sort of slightly quirky and corporate process-plagued laboratory in the sort of near future. You're attempting to fight off deadly diseases. You were never really expected to be on the front lines. Other teams were out there, were much better organized, better funded, had better glossy brochures, had megacorps in their pocket, but through one thing and another, they are all either, unavailable, sick, or accidentally locked in malfunctioning emergency bunkers. And so it is up to you and your team of slightly quirky, slightly misfit scientists to save the world. You are attempting to take design cards, which have pictures of blocks on them, and you are placing them cooperatively to fulfill certain requirements in terms of what blocks show, what blocks are touching what is showing on these cards in order to meet the requirements to make design cures for certain diseases. After you have then, put them all together, then you take this thing which you've designed, let's say a simple one would be like this, and you then need to take the blocks which are shown here, and with one side being down, where this shows this must touch the table, every pair of lines shows what's touching and what's not. And you then need to build this structure which you have designed in order to basically synthesize the cure. After you have built the structure out of physical building blocks in real time, then that earns you sort of both knowledge about the diseases in question and sort of side data, which you use to get these master cure tiles, which you puzzle together in order to capture insight into what is in common between all the diseases, fabricate a master cure, and win the game.
On paper, this seems like about as much of a departure from Spirit Island as can be, but I imagine that from a designer perspective, there are certain commonalities to your approach, and like, how would you describe what makes an Eric Royce joint?
I've often said that this game, like, if you're looking for objective criteria, the three things that this game has in common with Spirit Island are: it was designed by me, it has spatial relations, and it's a co-op.
There you go.
Somebody recently pointed out there's a fourth thing, which I'm just narrowing in on, which is it uses interlocking simple systems to create complexity. In Spirit Island, a lot of people say, like, once you get the game, like, it has a fairly simple phase progression. You do your spirit stuff, fast powers, invaders, slow powers, lather, rinse, repeat. Playing power cards, like, the core concept is pretty simple. The elemental system is pretty simple. Fear is pretty simple. But when you take each of these systems, all these systems, and add them together, you get a very, very rich, complex environment. Same thing is true with Science or Die. The process of designing cures is very straightforward. The process of taking a design and making a build out of it is very straightforward. Spending things which you have earned is very, very simple. And puzzling together master cure tiles is also very simple. But when you put all these together, especially the feedback loop between the master cure tile, which you're trying to puzzle together, isn't just victory, but as you get more and more, as you capture more and more insight, it will buff many of your special powers to make you better able to fight the disease. Once you add that feedback loop in, then it creates this nice, rich ecosystem, especially when you combine it with the thing of real-time constraints. Like, you're constrained in time, you're constrained in space. Like, if you need a block, you need to be able to physically reach it or ask somebody to hand it to you. And you are constrained in the number of blocks you have available to you and in your attention to what you can do. So all those things create this, it feels very, very different at low player counts and high player counts. Like, in a 1 or 2 player game, you're going to be doing a little bit of everything. You don't really have a choice. You're going to be the one designing and building and doing the master cure and verifying other people, your teammates' build and thinking about all the pieces, and you're going to be doing them fairly sequentially. But there's some things you don't need to worry about, like you're not going to run out of blocks. In a 6-player game, if everybody tries to build at the same time, you're going to run out of blocks. So you need to coordinate and be like, okay, I'm going to build this big complicated thing here. If the two of you can work on these designs while I build it, then you can do your workshop builds while I'm doing this other thing and getting the master cure set up. So you end up with this interpersonal coordination, which ends up needing to happen, which adds an entirely different dimension to it all. And a degree of what I find to be pleasant hecticness. But.
So you have this design that was originally signed in 2015, 5 years ago, and then you have Spirit Island, which has taken on a life of its own, and inevitably it took a huge amount of attention for getting Jagged Earth to the state that it's ready to publish and is now in the actual production stage. Are you still pitching games? Are you coming up with new designs, working with publishers? Are you actively looking for new publication?
I have designs I'm working on. Due to having 2 kids and having all of my design time taken by Spirit Island and for Science, my pipeline kind of went dry for a while. I've started to fill it back up, but it's always in like fits and starts, because it's like I'll get some work on other designs in, and then Jagged Earth will take over my attention for 6 months. Okay, like I just started, Jagged Earth had wrapped up, and I started doing some of my own work and some collaboration, with another designer I've been wanting to work with for ages, and things were going interestingly with that. And then for Science, it's like, Kickstarter's happening. Okay, great. Okay, all right, gotta focus on this. Get all the I's dotted and T's crossed, and pay attention to that and answer questions and get files ready and make sure that the files the publisher is working off of are the same as the files I'm working off of. Also, pandemics are distracting, and so between just like the news and social distancing and like our kids being home 24/7, that means I've slowed way down. But yes, I do have things that I'm pitching at Origins last year, I think it was. 2 years ago, I had a very early stage prototype, which a bunch of 3 separate designers in Proto Alley said, you need to go and pitch this to company X in the hall right now, and I will go and make an introduction for you. I'm like, okay, I
Sounds
only came up
good.
with this 3 days ago. I don't think it's ready yet. But when three separate people tell you that, it's like, okay, great, I'll go do that. It didn't end up going anywhere. And I can see why. Like after playing with it some more, it's like, yeah, no, I think I'm reaching the same conclusion that they did, which is this is a great idea, but it's only half baked so far. And I've had one or two designs in the interim, which I've sort of shown off and been like, this would be a really good fit for this publisher. So let me go like talk to them, because if they are interested, I can develop it in their direction. Like, they may have a world which they want developed in, or they may have opinions about which way they want it to go. And so I've done those and gotten some feedback. But I'm only just beginning to build up to the point where I might have pitch-worthy stuff again. I'm looking forward to getting there, but working on these things, which I already have out there, is so much fun. So,
Yeah.
I can't really complain.
Well, you just strike me as such an imaginative and creative guy who's very thoughtful about the projects that you're working on. And, these two examples, For Science and Spirit Island, like I said, they're about as seemingly divergent as can be, and that seems like the type of thing that you're really interested in. I mean, you see that in Spirit Island alone. You have spirits that are dramatically different from one another, trying to test the boundaries of what you can play with within that system. And so I imagine that that's probably similar for how you approach games. You don't want to design Spirit Island 2. You want to design something that's completely different than what you've done in the past. And I wonder if, as you're making pitches with the monumental success of Spirit Island, if some of the reaction that you'll get is like, well, this is kind of cool, but can you make something kind of closer to Spirit Island? Like, do you have something like that in the back burner that you can, show me?
A publisher might do something in that very faint direction in terms of looking for a more heavyweight game, say, or in terms of, like, broadly speaking, game weight, or a very thematic game, or something like that. Because not all of my designs have been like heavy theme. Like Fealty, my first published design, was very much a lightly themed abstract. But beyond that, no. Publishers are, if anything, like, I have an aesthetic and personal preference for diversity of games. Publishers are keenly aware, like, if you publish something, it better be novel in some way.
Oh, yeah.
I think, I can't remember where I heard it, but I heard something like, there's three types of games which do well. Games which are about sort of refinement, where they aren't necessarily new, but they're one of the best examples of whatever they are that is out there, like, because they're so polished. There is something where it's like, ooh, that does something really new, or that does something so bizarre, I can't believe it possibly works. Where you kind of have like, incredible polish versus, ooh, interesting selling point, versus like the train wreck, how does that go? And those are the things that they can actually get people to be interested in, because there's so much competition for attention. So no, I don't think that most publishers are going to want me to design something which is just like, Spirit Island reskin. I wouldn't want to do that, and I don't think they'd want. Like, the closest that might happen is if Greater Than Games came to me and said they wanted, I don't know, like, like the Spirit Island dice game, like basically same concept, same IP, different type of game manifestation, type of thing.
Let's talk about Spirit Island dice game. We might need this. I could see it.
I've come up with interesting idea. I've fiddled around with the idea at one point. This is something, incidentally, Greater Than Games has not asked me for this. This is just something I've noodled around
with.
I did some concepts on paper. No, if Greater Than Games had asked me, I couldn't tell you about it. I've noodled around with stuff on paper, and I've come up with like things which might function, but nothing which I'm super enthusiastic about. I'm sure it could be done, but the question is whether it would be interesting enough on its own rights. Like, I'd want something which wouldn't fly just on the basis of the IP. I'd want it to also be legitimately interesting in its own right. So,
is there a type of game that is out there, either a genre game or thematic concept or something that you would really like to explore as a designer? Something that, if you had your way, it would be the type of game that's your next big thing.
I have like 10 zillion ideas.
Of course you do.
To explore. Yeah, no, there are too many answers to that. Like there's this one game concept I have tabled, which which should play between like, I don't know, like 4 and 40 players. And the problem is that playtesting with 40 players is something which is just totally infeasible, even when there's not a pandemic. Ideally, the concept in my head would scale between 4 players sitting down to play a Euro at a table and all the way up to you're running a mega game at a con.
You are bonkers.
Yeah, it's and this isn't totally new. Like Friedemann Friese has a game which plays, I think, 2 to 6 normally, but you can run up to 3 tables of it at once, and people can transfer between boards. The game I have in mind is sort of a political court intrigue faction game where you may have allegiances to different factions, and you're trying to get stuff done either for your own personal goals or your factions, or to make factions who aren't yours happy with you so you can swap around between them. And it ought to scale tolerably well to very large player counts, because it's sort of like you have if you've ever played Senji, where there's sort of the opening phase of politicking, similar thing where you'd have like this opening, everybody's going around cutting deals and transferring things. But then at the end of that, everybody has basically, pre-programmed actions which are executed, which you should be able to blitz through pretty quickly and possibly even in parallel. So anyhow, that's a concept I'd love to explore. I would love to see more games which deal with victory conditions, which are not standard ortho game, one winner, everyone else loses victory conditions. I'd love to see games where, I've had several different game concepts where you might have 2 different types of victors, where you have like winner type A, winner type B, and if you win both of them, great, could be one person, but, you might not get both of them. I'd love to see games where, which are independent victory, where every player independently can win or lose. And I know why there's fewer of these games. Designing them is hard, because if you don't have they win intrinsically makes me lose, then you end up, the types of incentives you're dealing with are very different. And most of the established body of game design deals with this basic ortho game premise. So we just don't have the work to build on as much for games which could be emergently competitive or emergently cooperative. Or even socially one or the other. And there are some people who are like, no, I only want like full competitive. If somebody else can win and that means I lose, I don't want to deal with that. Fine, that's fine. They can go play the 10 million ortho games which already exist, or the other ones which will invariably come out. But there's so few games which work with with this like huge space of other possible victory conditions and ways of achieving victory. And the huge popularity of cooperative games, I think, means that there is ample space for people who are open to other types of victory. Like, I know I'd love to play in a game where maybe I win, maybe I lose, maybe my friends win, maybe my friends lose, and I can, a Cosmic Encounter does it a bit with the shared victory conditions.
Sure.
You can say like, oh, I'm going to do this thing in the board play, because that means that other players are more likely to take actions which allow me to win. And I don't mind that it also helps them. Like, you can end up with genuinely non-zero-sum game dynamics. Like, those are great. It's neat.
Well, if anyone can crack the nut and bring it to the masses, I think it's you. And I think that's going to do it for us today. I really appreciate you coming on to the show, Eric. You have Jagged Earth is coming on the horizon. Any news about when that's actually going to come out?
Why don't I give the quick rundown of the 3 different things we've talked about and how you can get at each of them. So Jagged Earth, I don't know exactly when it's coming out. That is entirely a publisher question. They're the ones who are on talking to the factories and figuring out what the pandemic-inspired delays are. I believe the backer kit for it is open through early May. I want to say May 8th, but I might be wrong on that. It might be May. I might be getting my dates confused. So basically, from when this posts, my impression is that it should be available for order if you act soon.
Yep.
The Spirit Island Digital is, as of now, like April 20th, is in Steam early access. It will be in early access for some amount of time as they gather feedback and continue to improve it and iterate on it. So that should just be available via Steam. And For Science has a Kickstarter which is wrapping up on May 1st. So if this posts as of May 1st or earlier, you can go look at the Kickstarter there. And also, they have like loads of videos and all kinds of information, which I wasn't able to go over. Way more information. They've also hit a lot of stretch goals already, and hopefully more to come. If it is wrapped up, I am positive that they are doing some sort of pledge manager type thing. I don't know the details of that, but I've been told that yes, there'll be a pledge manager, and there should be details on the Kickstarter page.
Well, I'll have links to all of that in the video description and podcast description for everyone to follow. So once again, thanks for coming on to the Cardboard Herald, Eric. It's been an absolute pleasure.
All right, it's been great.
If you enjoyed this video, we have all kinds of other reviews, interviews, and recommendations via writing, podcast, and video here on our channel and website, cardboardherald.com. Our content is audience supported, so if you want to show your support, please visit our Patreon. Thank you so much for watching. This has been the Cardboard Herald.